Okay, I'm going to be talking to you about the sources of textiles and food materials. I'm actually going to start with textiles, and I'm going to talk to you about some of the most common textiles materials. Now, synthetic, generally speaking, means something that is man-made and is synthesized. So synthetic fabrics are fabrics that come from something that is manipulated. Our most common synthetic fabric would be polyester. Now, polyester, like polythene and polypropylene, comes from an oil-based substance. So synthetic fabrics, generally speaking, are from a non-renewable resource. So synthetic fabrics, their main properties are being quite waterproof and repelling any dirt. This is because, as it's an oil-based material, they don't generally absorb any water. This means that they will dry really quickly and are very unlikely to shrink. The next type of fabric I'm going to talk to you about is actually natural fibres. So natural fibres are either cellulose or protein. Now, cellulose means that it comes from a plant. So, for instance, cotton comes from a plant, as does linen, which comes from a flax seed. These fabrics, generally speaking, tend to be quite expensive, and when they are wet, they tend to stay quite wet for a long time, which means washing them is quite difficult. They're very easy to stain, however, when woven together, can produce a very strong material. Now, the other type of natural fabric is protein. Protein means that it comes from an animal. Any animal fabric would be from a fur through to a wool. Now, wool will absorb up to 80% water compared to its actual weight. So that means that when it gets wet, it stays very wet. It also means that it stretches really easily. Now, wool isn't so easy to weave together and ends up often being knitted. Wool also, because of the nature of it, because it's quite absorbent, we normally combine it with a synthetic fibre such as acrylic, which means that it will absorb less water and will dry more quickly. The third and final type of textiles material that I'm going to be talking about is regenerated fabrics. Regenerated fabrics are something that is made from something else. So viscose, which is quite a soft material and is often known as an alternative to silk, is actually made from wood pulp in a not too dissimilar process to how we would generate paper. This fabric tends to be quite strong, quite lightweight. It doesn't absorb very much moisture, dries very quickly, has a very nice sheen to it. It's also relatively low cost and comes from a renewable resource because unlike synthetics, it actually comes from something that will grow, and unlike natural fibres such as cotton, not a lot of pesticides are needed to be used on the crops to encourage growth. And that's something that's really important to acknowledge, is that natural fabrics are actually not very good for the environment. A lot of the chemicals that are used on natural fabrics or on the growth of natural fabrics are actually very toxic. So when people have to pick cotton, they often end up with diseases like leukemia, which is obviously very detrimental. With regenerated fabrics, however, that is not so much the case, and especially if they come from a resource that is actually well sustained. So now I'm going to move on and talk to you about the sources of common food materials, and I'm going to look at proteins and carbohydrates. Now, proteins, as we spoke about when we were talking about natural fibres, it actually comes from an animal. However, it doesn't just have to come from an animal. It also tends to come from nuts and seeds as well. Now, protein is absolutely vital for the growth and repair of our body. If you don't have enough protein in your diet, your body cannot repair itself. Protein comes from anything that is meat-based or nut and seed-based. The second one that we're going to look at is carbohydrates. Now, carbohydrates is needed for energy levels within your body. Now, most carbohydrates are actually from grain materials, so that means anything that is from any kind of corn or any kind of starch. So you often find carbohydrates in pastas, rices, and breads. It's normally categorised as beige foods. However, about a third of your diet should be made up of carbohydrates. If you exceed having more than a third of your diet in carbohydrates, however, you do tend to convert the carbohydrates into fat and store it in your body, which again can be quite detrimental to your health. Now, I'm also going to briefly talk to you about fair trade, because fair trade actually is covered quite a lot when we're talking about textiles and food materials. Now, fair trade is where the farmers are paid a fair amount for the produce that they have grown. Fair trade has really taken off over the last few years because people have become more socially and morally responsible. They don't want to see people in the third world in debt, which is where most of the growing happens. So, when you see a fair trade logo on a chocolate bar or on a natural fibred top, you know that the farmers are getting a good deal out of what they are growing.